On April the 26th, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The Soviet government told the world it was operator error. It was not operator error. The reactor had a fundamental design flaw that Soviet scientists had identified years before the explosion. That information had been classified. The men who died trying to shut it down had never been told their reactor could kill them for following procedure correctly. This is not the story of the explosion itself. This is the story of the years of suppressed warnings and classified safety reports that made the explosion inevitable. The RBMK reactor was a Soviet design with a characteristic that Western nuclear engineers considered fundamentally dangerous. It was called the positive void coefficient. In most nuclear reactors, if the coolant water begins to boil, the reaction slows down and the reactor becomes safer. In the RBMK reactor, the opposite was true. If the coolant began to boil, the reaction accelerated. The more steam, the faster the reaction. The faster the reaction, the more steam. Under certain conditions, this feedback loop could lead directly to an uncontrolled power surge. Soviet nuclear engineers knew about this. What was less known was a specific additional problem that made it dramatically more dangerous. The control rods designed to slow or stop the reactor had graphite tips. When a control rod was inserted into the reactor, the graphite tip entered first. Graphite accelerates nuclear reactions. For the first few seconds after insertion, the graphite tip would cause a brief surge in reactor power before the rod began suppressing it. Under normal conditions, this surge was manageable. Under certain low-power conditions, it could be catastrophic. An incident at the Leningrad nuclear plant in 1975 had provided early evidence that the RBMK reactor could behave in dangerous ways under certain conditions. A report was written. It was classified. The operators at other RBMK plants, including Chernobyl, were not informed. In 1983, another near incident occurred at a Soviet nuclear facility involving similar reactor behavior. Another report was written. It was also classified. The pattern of suppressing safety information was not accidental. Acknowledging the reactor's fundamental design flaws would have meant acknowledging that the Soviet nuclear program had built dozens of potentially dangerous reactors across the country. So the reports were classified, and the operators were left to run reactors with a critical flaw they did not know existed. On the night of April the 25th, 1986, the operators at Chernobyl Reactor 4 were conducting a safety test that required the reactor to be operated at low power. This was exactly the condition under which the graphite tip problem was most dangerous. The operators did not know this. Their training materials did not mention it. Their reactor manual did not mention it. Nobody had told them. During the test, the reactor power dropped lower than intended. The operators spent hours carefully bringing it back up to the required level. When the test began, they followed their procedures correctly. When they initiated the emergency shutdown and the control rods began inserting into the core, the graphite tips caused a massive power surge. In 3 seconds, the reactor reached a power level approximately 30,000 times its normal operating capacity. The fuel rods shattered. The steam pressure became catastrophic. 2 explosions destroyed the reactor and blew the roof off the reactor hall. The men in the control room had followed their procedures correctly. The reactor killed them anyway. Because nobody had told them the procedures were designed for a reactor that did not work the way their reactor actually worked. The Soviet government's response was to minimize, suppress, and deny. The town of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 people living less than 2 miles from the reactor, was not evacuated for 36 hours after the explosion. During those 36 hours, residents went about their lives, children played outside, and radioactive particles rained down from the burning reactor. It was only when radiation alarms went off at a nuclear plant in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, that the outside world began to understand the scale of what had happened. The liquidators sent to clean up the disaster were often given minimal protective equipment and inadequate information about the radiation levels they were being exposed to. Over 600,000 Soviet citizens were eventually involved in the cleanup. Many were told the work was safe when it was not. The trial that followed prosecuted the plant director, the chief engineer, and the deputy chief engineer. They were convicted of criminal negligence and sentenced to 10 years each. The men who had designed the flawed reactor were never prosecuted. The officials who had classified the safety reports were never prosecuted. The bureaucrats who had suppressed the graphite tip problem for years before the explosion were never prosecuted. It was not until after the fall of the Soviet Union that the full picture emerged publicly. In 1991, the Soviet Nuclear Safety Authority finally acknowledged that the reactor design was the primary cause of the accident. By then, the convicted men had served significant portions of their sentences. No convictions were ever reviewed. The Chernobyl exclusion zone remains uninhabitable today. The destroyed reactor sits inside a massive steel structure completed in 2016, designed to last 100 years. What happens after that is a problem for future generations. The question Chernobyl forces you to ask is not whether governments are capable of suppressing safety information because the cost of acknowledging the problem is too high. The question is how many other reports are sitting in classified files right now describing problems in systems we rely on every day, and whether we will find out about them before or after the explosion.